Do psychedelics make people more empathic? Does coming off antidepressants before psychedelic therapy affect outcomes? Can MDMA change your personality? Can a psychedelic medicine without the trip still help with depression? In today's episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers Podcast, we discuss recent studies that seek to answer these questions and much more. For those of you who are new to the show, welcome. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus and is hosted by me, Dr. Steve Thayer, and my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison. A couple of announcements for you before we get into the episode. If you're looking for professional training pursuant to becoming a psychedelic-assisted practitioner, you can check out the courses we offer here at Numinus. Click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/training, and you can use the code PTF10 for 10% off selected trainings. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've likely heard Reid and I talk about the psychedelic clinical trial work that Numinus does. If you or someone you know is interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/research to learn more about the trials we're currently running. If you'd like to support our show, you can do so by leaving a rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, you can like the video, subscribe to the channel, or send the episode to someone you think might enjoy it. Without further delay, here is our research roundup on psychedelic studies and a few others. Reid, we're at it again.
Here we go.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers coming at you.
Should we do a research roundup today?
Yeah. We have a smattering of a smorgasbord, a cornucopia of studies that we're going to talk about today. Some psychedelic, some not. But they figured we might start with a psychedelic one. This is a recent study entitled The Rapid Effects of MDMA Administration on Self-Reported Personality Traits and Affect State. I love how obnoxiously long these titles are.
Titles are fun to land on.
A randomized, placebo-controlled trial in healthy adults. So, in a nutshell, about 34 adults, quote-unquote healthy adults, meaning they didn't meet diagnostic criteria for any kind of psychiatric illness, were given about 100 milligrams of MDMA to see if MDMA impacted their personalities.
This was a study, as the title said, on personality traits and affective states.
Right.
So looking at basically, do your personality traits change overnight with MDMA, and what happens to your mood?
Right. Yeah. We've talked about on the show before, there's sort of the phrase altered states for altered traits. How much does psychedelic experiences impact what we think is relatively stable over time, and that is certain personality traits? They measured personality using I think one of the 5-factor model assessments, meaning things like openness to experience, neuroticism, conscientiousness. I'm trying to remember them all. I can't. It's OCEAN is the acronym, but I always forget what it is.
When the cameras are in your face.
I know. But suffice it to say, MDMA, and this will come as no surprise to people who know the effects of MDMA, but that it seemed to increase trait openness and lead to an increase in positive affect about 48 hours after MDMA administration compared to placebo. This was a placebo trial.
Okay, so here's a question for you about this study. How much can you conclude on the matter? Given that this was a placebo-controlled trial, a randomized placebo-controlled trial, one that pre-registered even their hypotheses and things, which is all nice, but with a sample size of 34.
So a small sample size, which, usually we look at that and say, tough to generalize based on 34 human beings. Also, not a very diverse sample size. I think it was mostly white dudes, which they call out in the limitation sections on the study, that this is difficult to generalize.
We talked about this even during our interview on this show with Rick Doblin, but how researchers often turn to Utah to find healthy volunteers for drug studies who are drug naive. Not so much the case, but it still is the case in Utah that it's more than 50% Mormon, and many, not all, have abstained from drugs,
right,
as substances, as the religion says to do. So it's just been an interesting fun fact for Utah. But still, to this day, we are one of the top enrolling sites for psychedelic studies in the country, in Utah here, we have great participation.
Yeah. And I think this study would have even been more interesting if the participants were psychedelic naive. In reading this description of the participants, all of whom were previously familiar with MDMA through recreational use.
Yeah. It's interesting to see in the protocols that we've been doing over the past couple of years how this has evolved. Like clinical trials are evolving. The field is maturing as we go, right? In this Renaissance 2.0. But I think they used to be more strict on the matter, which makes sense. Earlier phase has to zero in on a tighter, cleaner population, if you will. But I think thankfully in these phase 3 studies, some of them anyway will allow up to 5 uses of a certain psychedelic in the last X number of years, for example. And we don't state the specifics of protocols, also because it could bias, enrollment in a study. But that's kind of a general thought that's interesting.
Yeah. And it does make me think with this study and others that do admit people who have previous experience with psychedelics, and yet they still see changes in the variables that they're measuring. You can pontificate and just sort of think out loud about the implications of that. We were talking about this being a test of whether or not MDMA influences a personality trait. But if these people had used a lot of MDMA before, and it sort of maxed out their openness to experience as measured by something like the NEO, then why would it increase again as a result of participating in this study?
Yeah.
But it's also a question about how accurate the construct is of personality too.
Yeah. And what this study does, and the paper actually states this, is the study kind of opens a door for more research on the topic. And practically speaking, if you're an academic researcher, you have to get preliminary funding for your hypothesis, your idea. Say you go in as an academic researcher with this idea, like Gould Dolan is studying critical periods, right? And not just in psychedelics, but with psychedelics. And you need to get those funded, and it's often federal or government funds, some people with foundation grants, some industry funding, although there can be biases and conflicts of interest that come with that, as we all know. But I point that out because a study like this, 34 is a good sample size. Like that's a lot of work, but it doesn't conclude everything, and probably isn't even adequately powered to really truly detect if there are these changes. We need bigger samples, but there were a couple cool signals that make sense, and their conclusion is we need well-powered, large samples and longer follow-up times to explore the impact of MDMA on one's emotional experience and one's personality.
So are you saying like these smaller studies, or maybe even doing it in rodent models first, give you something to reference when you want to seek more funding to do a bigger study?
Yeah.
Like, hey, we saw some good signals in here.
They give
There's
you
promise.
Preliminary data to go for the big, like, say, when you're starting your career, and this is like a funny little tangent of nuances, but there's something called a K award. A typical path would be for coming out of your postdoc, you'd be writing for a K award, early career grant that might give you several $100K to do a study, or like $1 million. But then like more established in your career, proven track record, preliminary data, like a team of researchers, then you might be getting what's called like an R01, for example. There are a million variations on this theme, but you got to do the preliminary study so that your group or others can justify with some positive signals suggesting more work, or some feasibility at least.
I also think it's interesting with studies like this, the smallish by comparison sample size, that it could be a reference or a launching off point for not only a continuation of this particular research question, but a stimulus for other research questions. Like if MDMA reliably increases positive affect and openness to experience, could we make the argument that maybe we should do a study on other so-called healthy volunteers to see if it can increase well-being generally? This is an idea that, is often talked about in positive psychology, that we shouldn't be so hyper-focused on just making the sick well, but what about making the well weller?
Yeah, there was a well-being study I pulled, if we want to dabble in it for a moment.
Sure.
It's a psychedelic one that was a survey study with a sample size of 457. So the paper title is Acute Psychedelic Reactions, Post-Acute Changes in Dysfunctional Attitudes, and Psychedelic-Associated Changes in Well-Being. And I think the main goal of this study was to look at the relationship between the cognitive psychology term dysfunctional attitudes and one's well-being through the course of psychedelic therapy, to explore that link. And of course, while doing a study, you're collecting all these other variables, like how much of a mystical experience was there during the dosing experience? Was there a challenging experience? Was there emotional breakthrough, etc.? And so they could correlate these changes, see if there are kind of modifiers or other things that influence the change you're observing. But that's a big picture. Maybe you can give us a little background on dysfunctional attitudes, though. Sounds fun.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't read that one, so I'm not sure exactly what they're referring to, but if it's from the sort of cognitive psychology world or cognitive behavioral therapy world, it's akin to self-limiting beliefs or cognitive distortions. So these are, especially if they are core beliefs held very, very deeply, maybe originating when we were young, like in childhood, that don't serve us, like the term dysfunctional implies. So it could be something like, I cannot fail. And if I fail, then all hell breaks loose, or I'm eternally alone. Or if I fail, it means I'm a bad person. You can imagine how that might be a dysfunctional belief.
It's a good example because, you can also see how one's mood state might hinge on this, or might be really impacted by certain life events and your resilience to these things that might happen out of your control. So this is really getting at the nuts and bolts of how psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy works, at least one area like of change. And I like that you called it, like, self-limiting beliefs is probably a more commonly used term, encompassing this and some other things. Or we talk a lot about maladaptive patterns,
right?
Yeah, things like that. The beliefs are one thing, the behaviors another thing, both important. But bottom line is the study found that changes after a psychedelic experience were significantly influenced by whether or not you had some substantial dysfunctional attitudes on board before, and also whether or not you had an emotional breakthrough during the experience. The emotional breakthrough even had a greater impact than a mystical experience or a challenging experience.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I've seen other research that's looked at these variables too, that shows, I mean, maybe I've talked about it on the show before, but that psychological flexibility, an increase in psychological flexibility, is kind of a mediating variable between things like mystical experience, even emotional breakthrough, and outcomes, and positive outcomes. So if you think about a dysfunctional belief as rigid and resistant to updating based on experience. Like, I've got people in my life who love me, but yet deep down inside, I still feel like I'm unlovable and I have to prove myself. I'm not flexible around that belief. Psychedelics potentially increase psychological flexibility. So then it makes it more likely that that belief is going to be updated by data you collect in your day-to-day life.
Yeah, it makes sense in a world of so much change and stress to be able to be flexible so you can bend and not break under that. Kind of, I view it like a willow tree or something like that, can flex in the wind. But the interesting thing about this one is that the effects of dysfunctional attitudes, having those, generally exceeded the acute reactions like emotional breakthrough or mystical experience or challenging experience, which also makes sense. But these are the kind of questions that need to be answered. Like, so we can predict response better, so we can more appropriately personalize and tailor treatment to an individual's needs. How many sessions are needed? What kind of therapy? And it would make sense that if there's a strong dysfunctional attitude on board, you're going to get some benefit in this case showing from especially the emotional breakthrough, but you also have a lot of work to do because that has an impact on your well-being in general and after the dose. Yeah.
So I might be misunderstanding, but is it so people who had sort of higher ratings on dysfunctional attitudes saw a greater benefit if they had things like an emotional breakthrough or less?
They were just showing that they had less well-being after, and likely before. We'd have to look at the pre and post scores and how they measured. As we're doing a rapid fire, like you mentioned, we're not diving into the supplementary materials of these, but giving a teaser trailer of new research that's come out. But yeah, that's my take, is that there are that matters to your well-being after, and then these mediators, these parts of the experience, can have an impact on it, but the impact of that dysfunctional belief is still standing there a little bigger, and you may need to mount your best therapy effort, and it may be a series like in the MDMA protocol for PTSD, a series of 2 or 3 dosing sessions.
Yeah, and it's also just a reminder that psychedelics are not panaceas, they're not silver bullets. It's not like you're going to do psilocybin and then all of a sudden your dysfunctional beliefs
narcissism
dissolve.
Gone. Not deeply wounded anymore.
Personality rewiring. And it could take several at-bats, like you were saying, more medicine sessions. But there is promise. And that's what a lot of this research shows. You want to pivot to another one?
Yeah.
So I've got one, the effects of classic psychedelics or classical psychedelics on implicit and explicit emotional empathy and cognitive empathy. Did you know that there's more than one kind?
classic psychedelics. Yes. What do you prefer?
I don't know that I have a strong preference.
Classic music or classical?
Yeah, I like alternative punk psychedelics. So this is referring to LSD, psilocybin, and ayahuasca in particular for this study. And so they did a meta-analysis of psychedelic studies that included a particular measurement tool that measures these different domains of empathy, the MET, the multifaceted empathy test, which is not one I was familiar with, actually, but lots of different scales that measure empathy. And you and I were talking before we hit record about this distinction between emotional empathy that is implicit and explicit. So meaning implicit emotional empathy meaning, the feelings that you experience in response to other people's feelings. Like I can feel what you feel. I join you in that feeling is empathy. Implicit refers to the automatic emotional resonance. So I see you crying and something happens in me automatically in my nervous system, and I'm feeling empathy for what the tears might represent, for instance, sadness. And then explicit is conscious emotional understanding. So it's like, I understand consciously you're feeling sad, and now I'm joining you in that sadness empathically. And so they distinguish that emotional empathy, those two subtypes, from cognitive empathy, which is a kind of theory of mind. Like I can understand how you might have different emotions than me, but it's not the same as like joining and feeling with.
Yeah. Yeah, that was an interesting conclusion of the study, because I was looking at that one too, that, the psychedelics showed significant enhancement of the emotional empathy, both types, not the cognitive.
Yeah. Which, I guess does make sense, right? I mean, psychedelics it's a very experiential and
they don't change your mind. Is that what you're saying?
Oh no, somebody call Michael Pollan. Yeah, well, they don't necessarily teach you maybe at a cognitive level about the emotions in other people's minds. But
they don't give you a lesson on the theory of mind.
Right. Wouldn't that be fun?
They change your heart.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Heart opening.
Metaphorical feeling body heart.
Yes.
Not the cardiac parameters that we're worried about. Yes. And monitoring
not
carefully.
The four chambers of your heart.
Yeah. Important distinction as well, but it is interesting. Yeah, it is. And I think we're in this era of this renaissance where these are fun questions that are getting explored. And it'll take a while for like the rock solid answers, the dust to settle or the muddy water to settle so you can kind of see more clearly perhaps. But these are really fun that these studies are being done and that we're starting to shine a light on these unknowns. Like that Stan Grof quote that we brought up the other episode again, like the psychedelics are in fact becoming like a microscope for the mind. And here are examples.
Yeah. In studies like this that show that psychedelics can help people be more empathic, it makes me think of, the advocates for cognitive liberty and that are just bewildered as to why psychedelics are illegal drugs. Like we have these drugs that, of course, we need to make sure that they're safe, and there's a long conversation to be had about legalization, medicalization, all that. But it just seems kind of wild that a medicine, a substance, a plant that makes you want to hug other people, or a tree, or gives you empathy for other people that you might have a hard time understanding otherwise, should put you in jail if you were to use it. Anyway, I digress a little bit.
Yeah, it's a very, very good point, and I think the answer to that we've also talked about on here. But you know what is multifaceted and complicated and depends on how we as humans are behaving, because look at the stories you hear about the original Renaissance when LSD was legal, and even when it was not, but when it was freely passed around to everyone at a concert, you would have a certain percentage, as you could imagine, who would end up with having a really bad time.
Yeah.
And the ERs were spilling over in some cases with bad trips where this drug was not causing physical harm usually, thankfully, but at least organ system harm. But it reminds me of, those mushroom gummies you can buy at smoke shops.
Oh yeah.
That's an interesting experiment to see play out, because no one really knows what's in these gummies, but you can buy these psychedelic gummies legally at smoke shops in America that have a mystery sprinkle of some psychedelic in it.
Proprietary blend.
Yeah, like proprietary nootropics. And because there have been a few bad outcomes where the powers that be have had to get involved and apply some laboratory testing, some of those have come from, some of the mushrooms say amanita, which can make you trip, but also has some toxicity at those doses. It's a fine line. But so they're showing some amanita-related stuff, but mostly these things seem to contain 4-ACO-DMT, which is a synthetic psilocybin relative, pretty close. Like in some parts of the world, they'll use this interchangeably for a guided mushroom experience. In Canada, I've heard they do that a lot. Very different dosing because you're doing milligrams of 4-ACO-DMT, but there are conversions. And so when you have these things being sold freely everywhere, and kids, adults taking them without even knowing the dose, and some eat a whole bag, some eat a gummy, you get a lot of data. And I went through a bunch of Reddit threads on different brands because people ask me about them quite a lot. And I've seen just this wide gambit of one comment in a thread will say, my wife took 4 gummies and I've never seen her happier in her life, my life. And then the other one's I took 7 and I ended up in the ER.
Right.
Like literally. And they're telling this crazy story. And so, yeah, that maybe gets to the tricky question of why are some of them, why did they become regulated?
Yeah.
And what do we do now?
Yeah, it's a great counterpoint. Why circumstances in which regulation is really, really important for safety reasons and education. And like the supplement industry widely, I doubt that the gummies being sold at smoke shops have this stringent testing and requirements. And so maybe the variation in responses is not only individual variation of how people respond to this stuff, but it could be variations in doses or what's actually in the gummies.
Yeah, the supplement industry is the Wild West, and we're in the epicenter of it here in Utah. There happen to be a lot of supplement companies. We had who's Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah back in the day, and he was one of the proponents of kind of making the supplement boom possible and making the regulations less restrictive for companies. And so you have, on the one hand, prices going down, access to good quality things like omega-3 fish oils and whatever else you might want to take. And you also have an industry where anyone could make something in their garage in theory and put anything in it and label it something else.
Right.
And that does happen as well.
Yeah. And you see, is it examine.com that sometimes, I don't know if it's them, but like you see some third-party testing places that will take a sample and say, this is what they say that's in it. And some of them are just wild. Like it actually has none of what they say in it, or it has wildly different concentrations of what they say.
Yeah. So. I looked in one of these smoke shops the other day when I had like 10 minutes to spare, and it was interesting. Like I was just looking up these things on my phone, read it and the different packages, but there were these mad honey sticks and like psychedelic honey from the Himalayas or whatever's in it. But it's confusing, and they're not even mentioning what's in it. Those ones, like most supplements, the label will at least tell you the ingredient list.
Yeah. Well, we mentioned proprietary blends. Sometimes they'll mention a few ingredients, and then it's like, and then a proprietary nootropic blend, and they don't really have to say exactly what's in that because it's proprietary.
I think they're supposed to say it and list them, but they can collapse it into proprietary blend, including like phenylbutyrate and all this other stuff at 1,000 total milligrams. So the competitors could not match the exact
formulation,
but you're supposed to be able to know for safety reasons what ingredients are in it, but they do not, of course, list 4-ACO-DMT. And I cannot tell you for sure that it is in most of these mushroom gummies. I'm just watching as a psychopharm researcher in the space, watching this like almost real-time experiment unfold, and it's it's really interesting.
Yeah. So proceed with caution, folks. If you're going to buy gas station or smoke shop altering consciousness substances.
So can I throw a mouse study into the mix?
I love a good mouse study.
Let's get out of humans are complicated. Human territory. So this one is called, here's a good title because it just says it. The non-hallucinogenic serotonin 1B receptor is necessary for the antidepressant-like effects of psilocybin in mice. And so, hearing the title, what's your take so far?
Well, a lot of times when we talk about the mechanisms of action of psilocybin, it's the 5-HT2A receptors, right? The serotonin receptor that, and it's not usually these other serotonin receptors that are often talked about or implicated. And so we also often think about it is the hallucinogenic or the very phenomenologically psychedelic effects that are connected to positive outcomes in depression studies. But this is saying that maybe there's some non-hallucinogenic receptor sites that are important.
Yeah. Who's our friend in Wisconsin and mentor doing the dream, like psychedelic while asleep studies?
Shoot.
Chuck
Raison.
Which is trying to get at that question too, of like how much of the waking experience of psychedelics is needed for one's transformation. And here's one study pointing at some antidepressant effects of psilocybin hitting a non-trippy receptor, which is 1B in mice. Interesting. Yeah.
So again, I'm just sort of speculating as a launching off point, this study being a launching off point. So would there be any interest in formulating something that just hits those receptor sites to see if, that alone without the psychedelic effect could have an antidepressant effect?
I bet there are drug companies who probably already screened that digitally or in real life, or are doing so now. But And that's part of what we saw when the funds were really booming into psychedelic biotech, of like exploring all sorts of different compounds. How much antidepressant activity do you get from it?
It's an empirical question, I guess.
Yeah, and I think we know how the psilocybin studies have gone so far. In fact, we were just citing data from Compass that was a secondary analysis looking at antidepressants. We didn't talk about that study yet.
Yeah, we can talk about it next, though, if you want.
We were talking about that before we hit the record button. So anyway, we will talk about that. But my strong hunch is that you need more than just the 1B receptor activity for the kind of antidepressant effects we would like in real humans. As we're seeing, like, it's still not the absolute response remission rates that we want to see. Like, there are still some people left struggling with symptoms, even with, after looking at the data, even if they got psilocybin.
And it tracks with what we understand now about what depression is at the biological level. It's like a very, very complex thing. And it involves more than just one neurotransmitter or one receptor site. It involves lots of complex circuitry and also questions about how we even define it and we've talked about that a lot on the show, so I won't go down that tangent. But
yeah. You know how they did this study? Last thing I'll say on it is just kind of interesting. I used to do, this was way back in undergrad when I did mouse research, but in this case, how would they test whether or not this receptor is necessary? Well, the way they did it was they bred mice lacking 5-HT1B receptor. It's like the transgenic mice, essentially. And then you can see what happens to them versus mice where you didn't knock that out.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the ones without it were more depressed, like more mouse depressed than the ones that had it?
Yeah, and so they did some network analysis on top of this. So if only papers were that simple to just follow. Like, sometimes there's a lot of statistical wizardry going on, but at least if you're reading a peer-reviewed journal, you can rest easy knowing that people with expertise in that particular analysis and approach were used to scrutinize the paper as well.
Yeah.
Even if I cannot scrutinize the network dynamics myself.
Sorely disappointed. Cool. Well, yeah, let's talk about that Compass analysis. This is a post-hoc analysis. The title being The Impact of Antidepressant Discontinuation Prior to Treatment with Psilocybin for Treatment-Resistant Depression. So it's really common when people are being screened for participation in these psychedelic studies that if they want to participate, they might have to come off of some of their medications, particularly antidepressants and other psych meds. And so there's been a question about whether or not that, because it can be pretty rough on people, whether there's a difference in outcomes between people who have to discontinue and people who maybe came in not on any psychiatric medication to begin with. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. So when people come into our studies here, because we have multiple psilocybin studies going on right now, one for MDD, one for TRD, for example, in our Draper, Utah research clinic. And the interesting thing is, for a treatment-resistant depression study, you have to have had 2 or more failed trials to antidepressants in your current episode. So chances are you will likely come in on one of those. But in the studies up till now, you have not been allowed to be on an antidepressant during the study because it needs to look at the impact of psilocybin first and foremost by itself. And so people come off of it during the screening period if it seems safe, if they're willing to, and everyone's on board during that screening period. And this was a question of, is there a difference in the subjective effects on psilocybin and what happens next between when comparing the groups of people who came in and needed to get off their antidepressant or came in already off? They've been off it a while, cleared out. And there was not.
Yeah, so that's the punchline, right? That there didn't seem to be a significant difference. So finding no relationship between antidepressant discontinuation and worsening depression severity or compromised psilocybin treatment efficacy. which I'll be honest was kind of a surprise to me. I mean, just having been a therapist on a lot of these different psychedelic studies, and for some of those participants, I know I'm looking at each individual and they're aggregating the data.
Your hypothesis?
That people, that outcomes would have been worse for people who had to come off medicines.
How about subjective effects? Blunted at all? Would you have guessed?
I mean, I think it depends maybe because it's...
We're not talking about people on them either. Yeah.
The washout period is usually like what? 4 weeks, depending on the medicine?
It depends on the medicine, but the easy answer is 5.5 half-lives of the medicine. Mm-hmm. Like, the quick and dirty math we'll do in studies and prescribing is just times the drug by 5.5, and when it's fully out of the system. So for Prozac, that is a number of weeks, but for Paxil, it's not.
Yeah. And so that quick and dirty math is based on probably averages. Like there might be some individual genetic differences or metabolic differences. Yeah. And so for some of those people, maybe they still had some of it on board and it could affect subjective experience.
I think it's cleared out for everyone. I think that's a safe estimate. Like the studies make sure it's cleared out, even if you're a slow metabolizer at cytochrome P450 2D6, which is relevant to Prozac's metabolism. You still should have enough time that Prozac is out of your system. But what is your system like?
Yeah. So what is what kind of state does it leave your system in after, especially for people who've been on it for years?
Like post-acute, or like acute and then later, what happens over time?
Yeah. So yeah, my guess would have been that if they've experienced some emotional dysregulation, having come off the medicine, maybe they're not in other kinds of therapy because they're participating in this trial, they would have put them in a sort of a rough state, and that might have affected outcomes.
Yeah.
But maybe not subjective experience.
Yeah, because this is getting at that question. Like some people worry that recent use and recent discontinuation of antidepressants would interfere with psilocybin, but this paper looking at data from 233 participants in TRD trials is starting to answer that question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think there's some question about whether or not people, like when psilocybin gets into the medical clinic or the mental health clinic, can people stay on certain, like SSRIs, for example, and still do it? Can we just adjust the psilocybin dose? And that would take some precision prescription that we probably don't know how to do yet.
Because up until these trials and studies like this, we all had the question, but we didn't have good data. It's hard to get data from the underground.
There are a lot of anecdata, like people just saying, I was on Prozac and I tried 5 grams of mushrooms and nothing happened.
Anecdotal data that forms our hypotheses, but how do you test it when you can't get the ethics approval to test it in the underground unless it's data you happen to have that you can get ethical approval to retrospectively look at that isn't a prospective study anymore. But until these things came along and we can start to answer those questions, because it'll matter. Like I remember Synthesis Institute, the retreat center in the Netherlands, their first many cohorts, no antidepressants were allowed. But then when they were getting really interested in research questions, they had Rosalind Watts helping from Imperial. They started letting in a cohort or 2 with antidepressants, and then they had that data. Clinical trials have been slower to follow, and this is not looking at people on antidepressants, just to clarify, because we might see a blunting of some subjective effects in some people if that were the case.
Yeah. So anyway, interesting study.
Cool.
What else you got?
Well, should we venture into non-psychedelic territory?
Sure.
Okay. This one I printed in the headline's huge. It's a good opportunity to just point something out, though, that when you're reading the title of a paper, I think you can trust that the title of the paper has done its best job. There's still some clickbaity ones,
sure,
but it has been peer-reviewed, even the title. But the news headlines reporting on it do not have any level of kind of filter, so they can make misleading claims. One thing to do when studying a study or testing a test is just make sure you look at what the actual headline and abstract says. But this title in the news story says the disturbing impact of exposure to 8 minutes of TikTok videos revealed in new study.
Revealed.
So now you're wanting to know.
Sure.
You want to know what it is.
Interest is piqued.
It doesn't tell you in that, because it's not the real title, but this was actually an eating disorder study. So they exposed one group of people to pro-anorexia content on TikTok and people to neutral content. This kind of content has a long history pre-TikTok even. It's called pro-ana, or often abbreviated to and personified to Anna. And Tumblr was like, did you ever see that Netflix documentary To the Bone?
No.
Eating disorder movie. It's a really good film. I'd recommend it. Keanu Reeves is the psychiatrist.
Oh, interesting.
In it, and I think he's fun in there. But the main character, I forget her name. She does an amazing job in this movie. Lily, I think maybe is her name, but she is an artist, kind of tortured artist, and sharing sketches on Tumblr, but there's a lot of like strong eating disorder community there. But anyway, it's traditionally been a big problem, these hot pockets of content. And an interesting question, what happens when you expose people? So here's the interesting thing. Women who viewed the content on the platform that was pro-anorexia experienced, like you'd probably expect, a significant drop in body image satisfaction and were more at risk, even after just that 8 minutes, of internalizing societal beauty standards, which we know in our society tend to be impossible, whether you're looking at Twiggy body type or the Kardashian body type. Like, it used to be called the thin beauty ideal. I wouldn't call it that now. It's the impossible beauty ideal that persists through the ages in different ways. But interestingly, so women exposed to seemingly neutral TikTok videos reported reduced body image satisfaction, like suggesting that platforms like TikTok could have a broader impact on self-perception regardless of the specific content.
I wonder how they judged it to be seemingly neutral. Like, are they just looking at cat videos and then all of a sudden they have a decrease in body satisfaction? That would seem odd. Yeah.
So nature, animals, and cooking.
Huh.
Cooking, but then the other group was young women restricting food intake, humor about disordered eating, weight loss tips, such as using ice cubes to curb hunger. Those are the kind of content.
I mean, that makes sense. But
yeah, but nature.
Yeah.
Cooking shows.
Weird.
It does make sense that, like, it's hard to escape the fact on social media that you are watching others display their lives, and there is a self-perception kind of challenge inherent in that.
Yeah. My younger brother used to have a blog, and he wrote an article called Lifestyle Porn, and this was years ago. But he in there, he talked about kind of this, and his focus was what he called mommy bloggers, but who basically depicted online just this impossibly beautiful life. And the people who know them would be able to attest that their life is not as impossibly beautiful as they depict. And so it doesn't take long before you're observing something like that, and it could be even subconscious, before you are comparing yourself to these other lives and finding yours wanting.
Yeah, so that is just one random study that caught my eye, but I got one more if
let's do one more
if you want. So this is another news headline says, depressed individuals mind wander over twice as often, study finds. Okay, so what's your take so far, Dr. Steve?
Yeah, I mean, my first thought was, makes sense. I mean, it's not uncommon for people who are depressed to ruminate, and to ruminate in particular on thoughts that exacerbate depression. So mind wander more than non-depressed individuals.
Yeah. So I
find chicken
this,
or egg issue too. Like, is mind wandering leading to depression? Is depression leading to mind wandering?
Yeah, because it brings up this good question of, like, what is mind wandering and in what ways might it be bad? Like, because daydreaming can foster creativity, And that's one type of mind wandering. But mind wandering also encompasses anything thinking about the past or the future, or ruminating, like you mentioned. And so mind wandering, we already know is more, has been associated with like some negative affective emotional states. In fact, there's a big paper called A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind. And I think Dan Harris and his kind of meditation crusade, the 10% happier idea, has cited that or talked about it a lot too. But it's this idea that that you have less activity in the default mode network when present, and more positive mood. But when your mind goes anywhere else, I'd say with the exception of like brief, pleasant mind wandering that is normal and healthy and has all sorts of benefits, like excessive,
reminiscing, for example.
Well, and reminiscing would be a form of if you reminisce like a large part of your day and you're not present for your day, you are going to be less happy.
That makes sense. But maybe just savoring a pleasant memory for a moment.
Not to say that slap your mind the minute it wanders anywhere. It's interesting from like a part standpoint, or from like just being gentle with our human machinery, and knowing that some things, like most things, are not inherently good or bad. And we're talking about like excessive mind wandering, especially when the content of your mind is highly negative, given you're in the throes of a major depressive episode, for example. So anyway, that doesn't really tell us much other than reaffirm and validate the experience of depression that is, and put a number on it, that like the mind can wander twice as much. And it's something like I can get on a soapbox on all too readily of like, I think we should pay more attention to our brain health, to our cognitive functioning, our executive functioning, our attention. I think we should work on our attentional abilities, especially in a world where our attention is pulled in a million directions and people are getting less able to sit with books and even shows and things like that.
Yeah. And you referencing the default mode, of course, nowadays people often talk about the default mode network in reference to psychedelics, the effect that psychedelics have on sort of downregulating that default mode and putting us in the present moment. And there's some speculation about that being a potential mechanism by which psychedelics help depressed people.
I've even heard ketamine called chemical mindfulness. Yeah. And if you look at ketamine as an example, you are turning down the rumination machinery and slowing down thoughts as the dose increases, for example. Or people often describe it as a timeout, or we'd call it like, a timeout from your ordinary mind.
Right.
That wanders. Our minds wander a lot of the time.
Yeah, I had a client once who did psychedelic work and then said, "Oh, this is that mindfulness stuff that you've been trying to help me experience. Like I now I get it, because I was 100% present and I could see my thoughts sort of float by like on a stream and not be attached to those thoughts."
Yeah, if you've never had an experience of mindfulness, what is really the term non-judgmental present awareness really mean, right?
Yes. Especially if there's a phrase I heard once, it's hard to read the label from within the jar. So like if you have never been mindful, or never mindful in a way, non-judgmental, awareness of the present that is memorable, then it's hard to know. It'd be hard to know it when you see it, but then you have these psychedelic experiences and it's like, oh, I'm outside the jar. That's what it looks like.
Yeah. Well,
here we go. A fun little jaunt around a couple of different psychedelic and non-psychedelic studies.
We have fun doing it. And please, dear listeners, tell us if you like hearing about studies, and we'll keep dishing them out if you want.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Reid.
Thank you.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus. a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.